So this morning, we're going to be talking about wheat and weeds. And that seems like very kind of on topic for Harrison County because we are very agrarian and we grow things a lot here. And we know what it's like to deal with pesky weeds and how annoying they are, especially when you have to grow out and get them out of your flower bed when you're like 6 years old and you're really annoyed and allergic to poison ivy. And even though your mom tells you 900 times to put on those rubber gloves, you do not want to do it for some odd reason because they're uncomfy and hot. And then you get that poison ivy. So weeds cause us a lot of pain and hurt and grief, and they're time consuming, and you would much rather be doing other things than dealing with pesky weeds that grow up in your garden. And I feel like that's pretty obvious for all of us. I think all of us can relate to some example like that. And I always want to state the 3 points plainly at the outset, because if we don't get this structure right, we're going to misuse this parable. First, the first point is, what elements are at play? What is the wheat? What is the weed? What is the field? We're going to talk about what the elements are at play here. Second, we're going to talk about how we're going to answer this question. This is the big point. How do we live with the tension that weeds and wheat grow together, even in the visible church? And how does God mature us in that tension? And I'm going to repeat that because it's a big point. So the second point is, how do we live with the tension that weeds and wheat grow together, even in the visible church? And how does God mature us in that tension? And the last point is knowing that the day is coming when they will be separated, they being the wheat and the weeds. And that gives us final hope, the hope of full reconciliation, when weeds will no longer grow up beside the good weeds. So this parable is not complicated because Jesus is unclear. It's complicated because reality is so unclear to us. And also, we think that it's wrong to be frustrated by weeds. That we are not showing love by noticing that weeds exist. But weeds do exist, and they are very frustrating in the kingdom of God. And like I said, in Harrison County, I feel like everyone has been exposed to gardening to some degree or another. And then I'm going to give you another example. Whenever the grandfather sees the weeds, not the little kid, he wants to exterminate them very quickly. And so he finds this online advertisement for weed killer that says it won't damage your flowers or tomatoes. Yeah, right. And then he drowns those plants in weed killer. And we'll get into this analogy too later on, because that will kill the good fruit as well as the bad weeds. We want the world that's divided into neat little categories. Good people over here, bad people over there. Serious Christians over here. Hypocrites on the other side. Wheat on the right. Weeds on the left. But unfortunately, that's not reality. We don't live in that world. It's fantasy. We can't have that. The kingdom's come, but it's not here in fullness. We're living in the here, but not quite yet. We're living in the midst of weeds. Some serious weeds. That's what the here but not quite yet looks like. We get glimpses of goodness, but we also get a good taste of badness too. So how do we live without becoming naive, cynical, passive, cruel, or self-appointed judges? That's the next question. Because those are the options that people usually choose, from my observation anyway. The naive person says, "There are no weeds. I don't see any problems here whatsoever." They oftentimes dismiss the negative reality, even when it's staring them right in the face. The weeds could be growing up to here, and they would be like, "I don't see them. I have no clue. It's just a small little thing. No need, no need." And it's very frustrating for you because you're like seeing it. It's bad. It looks horrible. But there's nothing you can do to make them see it. And you can't have church discipline if we're not noticing the weeds and diagnosing the problem. We can't ignore it. Meanwhile, there's another person on the other side. There's a cynic who says, oh, there is no wheat. There's nothing good here. Nothing good could ever come from this field. Humanity's evil. Everything's evil. Churches are full of hypocrites. Why should we even go? And that's just the total opposite reaction. You have one person who says there's nothing bad, another person who's saying there's nothing good, or nothing good can happen. And then you have a passive person that says nothing can be done. It is how it is. That's just life. Why even bother? I think of Eeyore, one of my favorite quotes of his, why bother? And then you're just like, oh, Eeyore. And then the cruel person says, give me 5 minutes and I'll purify that field. He takes justice into his own hands. But in doing so, he sprays the weed killer on the good wheat too, more often than not. And Jesus says all 4 of these approaches are wrong. There is wheat. He affirms that. There are weeds too. He affirms that also. The field, it's there, it matters, it's important. The enemy's real too. But the harvest is coming, and you are not the harvester. So now that brings us to our first point. What elements are at play? What is wheat? What is weed? What is the field? So Jesus gives us the interpretation, and that is important. We don't have to speculate. It's just like the last parable that we have. The disciples are all confused, and then he's like, okay, let me break it down for you. And that's what that second reading was for. He tells them what everything means, nice and neat. He gives them a good framework to go about understanding what he's saying. So the one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. It's God, it's Jesus. The field is the world, and it's the church too. The good seed is the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, the depraved. The enemy is the devil, and the harvest is the end of days. The reapers are angels, and that's Jesus' own explanation. So let's reason it through carefully. First, the field is the world. And that means this parable is much larger in scope before it becomes about a singular institution. Okay, the field, before it becomes your home, before it becomes this church in particular, or any church, it's about God's world. It's the whole world. It's not just one place, it's every place. And the field belongs to God. That has to be said first. God has control over the field. The devil is not a co-owner. He doesn't have a part-time share. It's not Star Wars, even though I love Star Wars. It's not like good and evil are equals, and they're just fighting against each other, and it's the same, they have the same power. No, the devil's not a rival deity. He's not the dark half of reality. He's a vandal. He's a guy who goes into a good field of weeds and he plants a bunch of weeds. He's a trespasser. He didn't even create the field. He's just taking something good and he's marring it. And that's what we said is what sin does. The field was originally good until it became corrupted. It didn't start out chaotic. God made it good. And at the end, he restores its goodness. So just remember, Satan can corrupt, he can counterfeit, he can distort, but he can't create. He can only destroy that which is already good. He can't make anything new. God made the field good, though. And that means when you see evil in the world, you shouldn't say that just belongs to the devil and that's how it is. No, the devil trespassed. It's not his. When you see hypocrisy in the church, you should not say, well, I guess that's just Satan's. I guess that's just how it is. No, Jesus told us that this would happen. When you see sin mingled with holiness, false profession mingled with true faith, you should not be shocked into despair. The Lord already told us that this was going to happen in a world still distorted, where the farmer has not tended to his field, but left the weeds and wheat to grow up together. Now, what are the weeds? And this is where I consult my trusty book with the very German last name guy that I really like. He wrote the parables. He didn't write like the parables. He wrote a book called The Parables on the parable thing. So Simon Kistemacher is very helpful here. I really like him. He says the word translated weeds refers to a troublesome weed in the grain fields, resembling wheat. It is called zizanium or darnel. They become easily distinguishable at maturity, but not while growing up. They look just like wheat. So while they're growing up, while they're maturing, they look almost identical to each other. But when they've reached maturity, when they're done growing, they look totally different and are easily distinguishable. And that's the problem. The weed is not obviously a cactus growing in the middle of a wheat field. It's not something like totally bizarre out there. It resembles wheat. It grows near wheat. It exists in the cultivated field. It has proximity to the real thing. And that's what Satan does. He has proximity to God, to holiness, to something true. But it's not quite right. It's not quite the real thing. It's a weed. It's not a wheat. That's why the number for Satan is 666 and the number for God is 777. Almost, but not quite. Almost holy, 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 but just not quite there. And that's why hypocrisy is so dangerous. And that's why sin is so luring. Because it borrows, or it looks like a good thing. It even uses Christian language while refusing the life of faith. I think of when the devil quoted scripture to Jesus to tempt him. The weed is not an atheist who tells you he's an atheist. The weed is not the pagan who tells you he's a pagan. At least that's honest. At least you know where those people stand. No, the weed in this parable is counterfeit kingdom life. Counterfeit kingdom life. It looks like the real deal, but there's something wrong with it. And that leads you towards the path of destruction. It's the appearance of wheat without the fruit of wheat. It is religion without regeneration. It is Christian vocabulary without full submission to Jesus Christ. It is public profession without inward conversion. It looks like people who just show up to church, who use religious language, who say, God bless you, but then they go home and they beat their wives. Or they do something that is utterly abysmal, that you would question, does that person even believe? They have the appearance of weed, but in reality, are they a weed? And let's be clear, Jesus is not saying that some people are mildly annoying and some people are pleasant. No, Jesus says there are sons of the kingdom, and then there are sons of the evil one. There's two categories here. There's no middle ground, and that's sharp, because Jesus is making a distinction between two ways of living, two humanities. Those who belong to the kingdom, and those who do not. But here is where we must be careful. Because a weed is not the same thing as an immature piece of wheat. We talked about this in 1 Corinthians, how it's really easy for a brother who's new to the faith to backslide, because they so carry that muck and grime of the world, and some temptations are alluring. Every time we falter, it doesn't mean that you're a weed. Sometimes a Christian remaining with sin isn't a weed. If remaining in sin made someone a weed, then there would be no wheat in this room. There's so much good in the worst of us, and so much evil in the best of us. And that's what makes it hilarious to begin to speak as though we have God's vantage point, where we can label other people a weed or a wheat. That belongs to God. The wheat are not perfect people. The wheat are regenerated people who have been restored to the image of goodness and have been called by God to walk down the road of sanctification. The wheat are those who belong to Christ, those who Christ has made alive, those who may be bruised, slow-growing, immature, confused, still battling the flesh, but who have been claimed by the Son of Man. And how can we tell them apart? Well, Jesus says in John 8, the reason why you do not hear is that you are not of God. And that's one of the most terrifying statements in the New Testament to me. He doesn't say you need a more entertaining preacher or a better sound system or all these things. He's saying that if there is a moral and spiritual inability where you cannot locate God, that could be because you are not of God. Now let's reason carefully. Can sinners, apart from grace, regenerate themselves in faith? Can a weed turn itself into wheat by positive thinking? I want to be a wheat today. No. Can a dead heart raise itself? No. Does that make all human beings innocent in their inability? Also, no. We're all guilty. We all publicly do the sins that we know we do, right? We feel it in the very fiber of our beings. We know that we do things that we ought not to do. That's part of the reason why we're here. But yet, how do we know that we are weak? Because of Christ. Because of Jesus. Because you didn't open your own ears. Grace did that. The Spirit did that. The Son of Man did not merely sow a field and then walk away and then let it go. No, he tends to his sheep. He said, my sheep know me, and they hear my voice. It's a beautiful, beautiful image. It's a beautiful image that God knows his sheep, and they hear him. And they hear him. The field is God's world. The wheat are the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are those who are of the evil one. The enemy is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age. And Christ is the farmer. Not you, not me, but Christ. So if all this is true, if we're living in a world that's full of wheat and weeds, and we can't tell them apart because we don't have God's vantage point, we can't see into the heart. Billy Graham could have been the best liar on television. I don't know. I happen to think he wasn't. But you know what I mean. Only God sees the hearts of a person and can tell a wheat from a weed. Only God can do that. So who are we to condemn? But how, at the same time, do we live in this tension where the weeds and the wheat grow together, even in the church? And how does God mature us in that tension? Because don't we get frustrated by weeds sometimes? That's exactly what Jesus is saying. Weeds ruin the goodness of wheat. And it's frustrating. And we're growing up together in the same space. And it's corrupting the fullness of what the church could be, of what the world could be. So how do we live with that tension? How does God mature us in that tension? The servants ask what sounds like a reasonable question. Do you want us to go and gather them? And I don't think that's a wicked question. I think they're just trying to be hopeful. In fact, if they did not care about the weeds, they would actually be bad servants. Because the weeds are ruining the good wheat. A good servant cares about the condition of the field. So let's not draw the wrong lesson. The parable is not saying Jesus doesn't care about holiness. It's not saying Jesus does not it does not say Jesus does not condone the practice of church discipline. He does. It's not saying never confront sin. It's not saying doctrine does not matter. No, please don't walk out of here with that interpretation. That would contradict almost everything that Jesus taught. In Matthew 18, in 1 Corinthians 5, I think of so many passages that deal right to the moral seriousness of belief. The parable says discipline must be conducted in a loving, gentle, patient spirit, and it must aim at restoring the person involved. Because you never know who's a weed and who's a weed, and you never know who's a weed that's just really immature and having trouble growing up. And that's the difference. Discipline aims to restore, and and uprooting aims to eliminate. Our goal is not to eliminate. We leave the final judgment to God. We leave the final judgment to God. Uprooting says, I already know the final verdict. I can go out into the field and I can tell while they're still maturing what's a weed and what's a weed. But that's not true. That's not true. Discipline belongs to the church under the word, but final separation belongs to Christ at the harvest. Only he can tell what's in a person's heart. We can't. And that's where we get ourselves into trouble. We see a real problem, and then we reach for a forbidden solution. We get a diagnosis, we know that something's wrong, and we use it as an excuse to amputate or cut someone off. The servants aren't wrong that there's weeds, but they're wrong to assume that they can safely harvest it before the appointed time. Only God can do that. Only God can do that. And that sentence should humble every pastor, every elder, every church member and theologian who thinks the church would be pure if only it were given enough authority. Jesus is saying you're not omniscient. You don't know the field as the farmer knows the field. You don't know the roots. You don't know the final fruit. You don't know who is immature wheat and who is counterfeit wheat. You don't know whose heart God will break open next year either. And you don't know who looks impressive now but will be exposed later. It's like I said, weeds can look a lot like wheat. You don't know enough to be an angel. So how do we go about living then? How do we go about living? How do we go about living when we're living in this thing called, when we're living in the tension of more so than weeds and wheats, the visible and the invisible church? We see the visible church, that's people sitting amongst pews, like all of us are now, but we don't know what's really in their hearts. Some of us could be visibly wheat, but in our hearts we're weeds. We're not really regenerate, we kind of just use that language. We hold a lot of bitterness and resentment and anger, and we carry the muck and grime of the world into the church, and we distort the purposes of God. How do we conduct ourselves then? Well, I think it's almost self-explanatory that you don't make an accusation, you diagnose a problem, because you don't know what's in somebody's heart. Like I said, Billy Graham could be the best liar amongst us, right? And someone could just be really, really struggling with their faith. But it also means that people with religious credentials don't know God. Our former systems of evaluation need to cease. We got to start looking at the fruit. We got to start looking at the fruit. But we got to do so with discernment and with an aim to help and not an aim to make a final judgment. We live with courage, but we don't live with cruelty as a church. We live with discipline, but we aren't self-appointed judges. And that's the difficulty of dealing with a mixed field such as this. Hypocrisy is painful. False profession damages people. Church scandals make people question everything. When someone claims Christ and lives like the devil, it wounds the body in a serious way. But Jesus says, don't be surprised. This is part of the pilgrimage too. It means something for you as weeds. It builds an expectation, a hope within you, of a world that's going to be eliminated of the weeds. It's going to be an all-wheat field. It brings in hope. That tension matters because it lets us know that things are not how they should be, but they're going to be so much better. So much better. And it also lets us know, how are we maturing? It makes us question that. Are we maturing? Are we maturing when we learn to hate sin, but also hate patience? Are we maturing when we stop confusing our irritations with true discernment? Are we maturing when we say that is wrong without saying, therefore I know the final state of the soul? I think true maturation is when we practice the discipline for restoration and not humiliation. That is what maturity looks like to me. Let both grow up together until the harvest. Let both grow up together until the harvest. Not because evil's fine, not because truth is optional, not because holiness is negotiable, but because the farmer knows what he is doing. It's a trust exercise too. So in the here but not quite yet, we preach the word, we practice discipline, we guard the flock, we restore the repentant, we warn the hardened, we protect the vulnerable, we pray for the spiritually deaf, but we also examine ourselves, and then we wait. Not some passive waiting, but faithful waiting, obedient waiting, because God is still working, and God's final work is comprehensive work. And that brings us to our third point. The day is coming when they will be separated, and this gives us final hope and full reconciliation. If you have been wronged by somebody who has claimed the title of Christian, and you are like, how can that person claim that mantle? And I'm sure we all have them, by the way. I'm sure we all have them. We have all experienced hypocrisy. We have all experienced something that makes us not want to step foot in a church ever again, that leaves a sour taste in our mouth, that makes us want to vomit profusely, and it grosses us out to the very core of our being, because you're like, how can a person behave that way and go around with the moniker of Christian above their head? That's not the question. The question is, how are we living so that we don't act that way? How do we ensure that we're weeds and not weeds, or wheat rather, not weeds, plural, wheat and not weeds? It should make us examine ourselves. It should make us examine ourselves. It should make us trust in God that He will have the final say over His good garden. And He's not going to let it be destroyed for very long. And that's rightful. And we also pray that His will be done. Because sometimes, like I said, that evidently looking weed that claims the title Christian, maybe they're just really backsliding. And that should make us self-assess. Do we hurt the people around us? Are we acting like weeds before others? It's all about this self-assessment. There's a scripture, it's a powerful scripture. It says, look at the plank in your own eyes before you look at the specks in others. And if we all practice that, what a world it would be. What a world it would be. Like I said, all of this tension just gives us that final hope. When these things, when the weeds will finally be separated, and then we get to experience full reconciliation with Jesus. Because this isn't going to be forever. What we're experiencing now isn't going to last. If you're a Christian, this is the worst it's going to get. Okay? And it can get pretty bad at times. You get glimpses of the best of things, but like this is the worst it's going to get for us. And that's really good. That's really, really good. Because we go through a lot of hardship. We experience a lot of turmoil, and it gives us something really good to look forward to. Which is when God is fully in control, when He's like the sun. When we're without this strife and toil. When I don't have a prayer request list that's from floor to ceiling. When all our needs are met and satisfied, and the creation is restored. That's the day that's coming that we need to look forward to. That's the day when the weeds and the weeds will be differentiated. They grow together, but that's not forever. Hypocrisy also may hide for a time, but it's moving towards judgment. Somebody very wise once told me, and he was a psychologist, he said, no one gets away with anything, not even once. Now you may believe that or you may not, but nobody gets away with anything, not even once. In my experience, this is very true, because God has written reality. He created the garden, And you can't twist the fabric of reality without it snapping back upon you. Right? There's mercy, there's forgiveness, but you can't twist God's world without dealing with repercussions, without it destroying your soul, without it breaking a part of you, without experiencing without something happening to you on the back end, because the world is retributive like that. And God's justice will find you out in some form or another. So injustice may seem to flourish for a time, but it is always moving towards judgment, and especially final judgment. And we need to know that the farmer's patience, God's patience, is not weakness. His delay is not indifference. His mercy is also not confusion. He's not morally confused. He has a plan. The day is coming. And on that day, the Son of Man is going to send his angels, and all the causes of sin, and all lawbreakers will be gathered out, and the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of the Father. Isn't that a hope? And that's beautiful, and it's terrifying. And it's terrifying because Jesus believes in judgment, but it's beautiful because Jesus promises restoration. So analyze your heart. Look inward into your field. What kind of fruit am I producing? Am I producing something that looks like good wheat? Or am I acting like a bad wheat? Or am I really a wheat, but I'm kind of acting like a bad wheat before others, and I need to start acting like a wheat again. The day is coming when heaven and earth will be reconciled. When God's good world will no longer be choked out by weeds. And when the Son of Man will gather his wheat into the barn. But until that day, we got to be patient. We got to endure the hypocrisy. We got to endure the hardship. We got to endure that nothing will ever be truly perfect. But we don't stop acting. We don't stop seeing the wheat in the midst of weeds. The weeds in the midst of wheat. There's a balance here. And that balance looks like this. Be holy. Be discerning. Be hopeful. Be patient. And know that the farmer knows his field, even when we don't. Don't make final judgments. Know that the enemy will not win, even though some days it really looks like he will. Also know that the harvest is coming. And lastly,